everybody to Talks at Google. Our guests today are Dr. Yolande Strengers and Dr. Jenny Kennedy. Dr. Yolande Strengers is Associate Professor of Digital Technology and Society at Monash University in Melbourne, where she leads the Energy Futures program. She's also Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Faculty of Information Technology and Associate Director of the Monash Energy Institute. Her research investigates how digital technologies and AR are changing how we live. And Dr. Jenny Kennedy is postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Media and Communications at RMIT University in Melbourne, and associate investigator in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. Her research is focused on experiences of technologies within the home. Our guests are the authors of the new book called The Smart Wife, Why Siri, Alexa, and Other Smart Home Devices Need a Feminist Reboot, which discusses feminized digital assistants who are friendly and sometimes flirty, occasionally glitchy, but always available. Thank you so much for joining us at Talks at Google, and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
My first question, maybe unsurprisingly, is about the title of the book. Usually, smart devices are pitched as assistants or helpers, but you're using the term smart wife. Why did you decide to use this term?
Yeah, so the term really refers to a broad range of technologies that are coming into the home, like digital voice assistants, but also automated devices, home robotics, and also other smart home technologies, which are coming in to take up what were traditionally considered the kinds of tasks that were performed by the traditional housewife. So what we're kind of referring to there are things to do with homemaking, housekeeping, caregiving, and even intimacy or sexual services as well, sexual acts. So all of those kinds of things encompass, all those roles encompass what we term the smart wife. And what we're concerned about, and what the book kind of raises as its central ambition, is the kinds of stereotypes that are built into those devices and how those might be perpetuated more broadly through society in terms of reinforcing some of those traditional roles and stereotypes.
Yeah, and we wanted, I mean, the point of the title as well was a provocation. We wanted to really draw attention to some of the kind of the tensions and the issues in the way that we saw these devices being positioned and being experienced by people. And so the use of the idea of like the smart and the wife was really to try and bring attention to that.
In your book, you describe the concept of a wife drought. Can you describe what this means?
Sure. So the term the wife drought was a term that was coined by an Australian political journalist, Annabel Crabb. She wrote a book about it, basically looking at the history of marriage figures, but also about, particularly around the labour of being a wife. And what she found was that rates of marriage are declining. And one of the reasons for that is because fewer women want to actually or willing to be wives, because being a wife is not often that great for women. It involves a lot more work and a lot less happiness often. So, for example, you know, some of the statistics, like in Australia, women when they're married will typically end up doing more than 40 hours extra of housebound work than their partners. And they will do more housework even if they are also the main earner in the household. So the benefits of being a wife basically are very minimal for women versus the benefits of having a wife are very high.
But I think also the point to make is that the wife drought also refers to something that actually occurs in heterosexual relationships and in marriages, and not just heterosexual, probably any partnership, where the changes in society and in our sort of working lives, where we now have, you know, two adults working most likely full-time jobs, if not more, as well as doing everything else, has created a void where there used to be one person who was at home, who was the homemaker, who was the wife, who was the dedicated person who was available to kind of do all those kind of wifely tasks. So that's also part of the drought, you know, this absence of that person, that dedicated person who could do a lot of these homemaking and housemaking kind of tasks for us. And, you know, what a great kind of marketing opportunity and a great technological gap where all these devices, all these smart wives, as we call them, have come in to fill.
Yeah, at one point you're quoting Annabel Crabb with the quote, in an average Australian family, a woman will commonly behave like a housewife even if she isn't one, and a man will behave as though he's married to a housewife even when he isn't. I thought that was very poignant describing this. Looking back in time, you point to Rosie, the robot made from the Jetsons, as a prime inspiration for many modern smart devices. How do you think we've gotten from a Rosie, which specifically was not a wife, to the smart wife devices we're talking about today?
Yeah, I guess this is where our term wife is quite broad. And we don't just refer to it in the sense of just the traditional role of the wife, but of a person. It could be a servant, it could be a slave, it could be any other kind of helper over time, over history, that has really fulfilled that role of doing many of those domestic tasks in the home. And Rosie was one of the early sort of science fiction fantasies about what that could look like if it came in a robotic form. And, you know, Rosie, even though she was sort of a bit glitchy, she was, you know, really held up as being, you know, the ideal kind of robotic helper. And for many roboticists and also technology developers, the inspiration for smart wives as they, you know, as they've been developed and coming into our homes and lives. So we got really interested in Rosie because it's often cited as inspiration for things like robotic vacuum cleaners, for example, but also many other types of products that are coming into the home. And, you know, this constant search for a robotic helper that can really take up and take over the burden of so many household tasks. And it's not just Rosie. I mean, if you look back through science fiction, as we do in the book, there are so many precedents for smart wives in films, in books, in cartoons, that are stereotypically feminine and stereotypically have quite traditional sort of feminine values that are brought in again to kind of fulfill those roles and come back to this idea of a traditional feminine responsibilities for housework in the home.
I think, yeah, one of the things about Rosie, you know, is terms of the fact that some 60 years after her invention, we're still finding reference to that kind of model in the types of devices that we're finding in our homes now. Like, yeah, it's a long time ago, but we haven't come very far from it.
I think there's a Roomba that is Rosie branded.
Yeah, yeah. But you can buy
we also looked at, you know, what people name their Roombas, and one of the most popular names for a Roomba is Rosie. So it's not just technologists and you know, technology companies that are looking to Rosie for inspiration. It's also become what many people and users aspire to from these kinds of devices. You know, and there are other kind of precedents, like in Japanese culture, the inspiration has often been cited as Astro Boy, particularly for caring robots, which are growing in market over there. So, you know, depending on where you look culturally, you'll find different reference points, but all these kind of sci-fi imaginations of what it is we should be attaining for.
Yeah, I think that's like a great point. What Yolande's making is that how much inspiration we draw from popular culture and from science fiction. And one of the things that we have kind of pointed to in the book is how this has happened over time in terms of how we experience technology and what we imagine our future with technology might be. And it's also a great tool. Science fiction is a great tool to imagine those potential futures.
You mentioned the care robots, which seem to be a big trend in Japan, which makes sense in the way that Japan has a big fraction of aging population. Do you see that generally as a positive or negative trend? Because I can see like both sides of the argument.
Yeah, I mean, we have obviously concerns about the way in which robotic devices are being used for care, but also we do see positives. Like Yolande and I both do ethnographic work with different communities and groups, and especially vulnerable groups. Yolande's done a lot of work around the use of smart devices in aging populations, and I work in terms of with families from low-income backgrounds. And what we find is, you know, across a really like diverse range of contexts and experiences, that there are really useful. People are using these devices in really helpful ways that provide them autonomy and security and support. But one of the main negatives is when these care devices are used in place of human connection and empathy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the concerns we raise in the book, is that a lot of countries now, as part of their policies around aging populations, which is a problem not just in Japan but in many nations now, but also in terms of disability care and other forms of care, they're turning to care robots and robotics as, you know, the solution to those problems. And while they might be part of a solution, we're concerned that, you know, by shifting the responsibility over to technologies and investing very heavily in that space as the solution, we sort of lose some of the needed investment and priority to be placed on the, I guess, the caring industries, the caring labour, the employment of people in aged care, for example, which we know is a very underpaid profession and often very undervalued. You know, instead of kind of putting emphasis on that and how governments can support those kinds of agendas, we're leaning more towards these technology-driven investments.
So the first sort of devices I thought of when I was starting to read the book is devices like Google Home, Alexa, these smart home devices that are ubiquitous today. But we've already talked about other devices like care robots, like Roombas, like household helping robots. Do you see the smart home assistants like Google Home as a special category with specific problems and benefits, maybe, or are these do these all have somehow the same sort of problems?
Yeah, I mean, digital voice assistants are a unique category, and they're the one that kind of gets the most attention, and they're most easily identifiable as a smart wife, probably because many of them have default feminized personalities, and some also default female names. But I guess what the book tries to do is show that the gendering of these devices extends beyond just their voice and their name. It's also about the types of feminized personalities, and also one of the things that we're concerned about in the book is the incredible similarity of the personality types that are programmed into many of these types of digital voice assistants and their feminized attributes, you know, on top of that, but also in terms of the roles that they're being brought in to perform. So things like, you know, helping with to-do lists and household tasks, you know, all the things that the assistants do, and the kind of hark back to some of the roles that women would traditionally be doing, you know, kind of similar sorts of things. So, and while that may not necessarily, you know, be a problem in itself, you know, we certainly acknowledge that many of these things can be very useful. One of the things we're concerned about is how by building those stereotypes, those stereotypical attributes into the personalities of these devices, we reproduce those, we perpetuate those stereotypes instead of kind of thinking about how we can help to sort of move beyond them. And we with digital voice assistants in particular, we're perpetuating a very particular type of femininity that we don't see a lot of diversity in terms of the product range that's currently on offer. So while there might be, you know, I know that Google, for example, offers, you know, a male voice option and there's celebrity voices, the default still seems to be this female character, and that's certainly how it's also referred to, often in the media and in popular culture, and in many of the homes where we've been doing research and others have been doing research as well.
Yeah, one quick remark for everyone who's watching us. If you have questions, please put them in the YouTube chat. We will be we will be taking questions later on. My next question is just how did you get professionally interested in this subject? It's like what made you think you'd like to write a book about this?
Well, I had been researching technology uses within the home for quite some time now, and was really interested in the dynamics of the home and the way in which the introduction of different technologies kind of augments or intersects with those dynamics and sometimes troubles them as well. So I was looking, for example, at Australian homes as they introduce high-speed broadband into them in terms of what the rhythms and routines and sort of daily life practices were of the people within the home. And one of the things that I noticed was that there were very gendered practices around technology in the home in terms of who would make decisions about what kind of technology would come into the home, about who would be mostly responsible for setting up like a new device, say a new smart TV or a new Wi-Fi network, and who the other members of the household would fall to if there was a problem with that. So this was, I guess, pre these kind of voice assistants being so popular, but already was kind of aware that there were some on the market. And so Yolande and I came together presenting very kind of like similar work in terms of thinking through the kind of the gendered aspects of how technology gets used in the home, and we're looking at the kind of the emergence of these smart assistants and how that might trouble that.
Yeah, so for me, I had been working on the smart home for quite some time, and what really piqued my interest was when I would go into people's smart homes, and this is when voice assistants were just sort of coming in to Australia, and there would be a voice assistant there, and that voice assistant would actually become part of the research. You know, we'd start having conversations with it. They'd demonstrate. They'd be almost I have these interview transcripts where I have, the names of the voice assistants appearing as part of the transcript. So I felt like they were like my research participants in a way. And what really struck me about that was the kinds of conversations people would have with them. They'd say things, refer to it as the other woman. They'd talk about how she or her was sort of helping them, the kind of role that it played as this helper, but as a feminized helper. And that was something that really kind of got me very interested in that space. But also, as Jenny said, one of the things that brought us together was just the broader gendered aspects of the smart home. And what Jenny didn't kind of mention then is that it's typically men that are sort of bringing this technology in and setting it up when it comes to sort of smart tech. And that has implications for all the kinds of housework that gets done in the home. So what we were finding there is that smart technology can often create additional what's called digital housekeeping, which is all the kind of labour associated with keeping the technology running and setting it up and maintaining it and upgrading it and whatever else has to get done. And that was disrupting the actual, who does what, the division of labour of housework in the home more broadly, with women typically kind of picking up some of the more traditional labour. So even though these devices were getting brought in to help with the wife drought, this comes back to our earlier point, they weren't necessarily, they might have been helping with some of these tasks, but they were also creating additional tasks that wasn't necessarily helping overall with the helping with housework and easing the burden on everyone. So, that was another kind of aspect of it that we became really interested in, the kind of hidden or the additional impacts that come with having these kind of devices in your lives.
When you say hidden work that comes in addition to what you had before, what are you thinking of in terms of the home assistants?
In the additional work, did you mean?
Yeah. So.
Well, for instance, I've done quite a few projects with people with robotic vacuum cleaners, just as one example. And this has also been found in many other studies now as well, where even as the technology advances, there's a lot of sort of supervising of these devices that needs to kind of go on as it gets, there's a kind of tidying process first in terms of removing all the clutter from the floor so that the machine or the device doesn't get stuck on things. There's a process of kind of maybe monitoring it, making sure that, if it pulls in something that you're around to pull it out. But also most people don't think that it cleans at the level that is needed for a home to maintain a certain standard of cleanliness. So it's an additional or a supplementary cleaning tool with manual vacuuming still being used. So it's not necessarily displacing the physical manual vacuuming, but a potential additional vacuuming kind of process that adds to the overall cleanliness and comfort of the home, but might not necessarily be removing the kind of labour associated with vacuuming. So that's a very specific example, but I guess more generally, it's things like choosing what devices to buy, installing them in the home, making sure if you've got a kind of a bunch of different devices or an integrated system that it's all talking to each other, that when there is a blackout or a Wi-Fi outage or whatever it is, that which often we found disrupts all of the systems in the home, that there's someone available to kind of set that all back up again. Installing updates, making sure cables are neat and tidy. There's a whole range of things that are now required in these kinds of digital environments that we live in.
Yeah, I remember the story about the vacuum cleaner that spread dog poo all over the place.
Poo copperlicks? No, poo copperlick. I'm not getting the word right.
Something like that.
That's it, yeah.
That was probably not the intended way how the device works.
No. But yeah, there's a lot of work basically in getting these things to work, and the more complicated and sophisticated the setup, often the more work that goes into keeping them up and running, and the more often they actually fall down.
And of course, the natural kind of counter argument to that as well, maybe they're just emerging and they need a bit more time to get established and things will get easier. That's not something that we're seeing yet in our research. So even as these devices are advancing, they're changing, either the software or the hardware is changing. I'm not seeing any less sort of digital housekeeping as a result of more advanced technology. I don't know if that will change in the future. Maybe it will. But at the moment, that's certainly not what's currently happening. So even though it seems kind of intuitive that this stuff will improve and that the housekeeping associated with it will diminish over time, that doesn't seem to be playing out yet in the research that we're doing.
Why do you think that so many of the devices are produced with female characteristics, whether it's the voice or physical attributes? Yeah,
I mean, one like the female voice. I mean, obviously, like the most ubiquitous type of smart wife is the voice assistant, and there's a lot of research to suggest that people prefer, in many ways, a female voice, or we've been taught in our society to prefer a female voice within particular contexts, and especially when those contexts are domestic or around care or requiring some kind of trust. So it makes sense that an assistant that's going into the home that is going to want to encourage users to make use of, to ask questions of, to provide data to be as couched as trustworthy as possible.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I'd actually love to ask your colleagues on the call, as I'm sure you've done a lot more research about this one than we have. But, from what we understand from the research we've done, it's very much about likability and usability. And, falling back on those stereotypical feminine traits is, I get it, it's a familiar, it's likable, as Jenny says, it's trustworthy. What we're interested in is if we can challenge what likability is, if we can kind of innovate around likability, certainly not kind of advocating for, angry, evil voice assistants. But we do wonder if there are other ways to achieve the same aims with different types of personality traits.
One category of robots we haven't talked about are sex bots, which you have dedicated a chapter to as well, which is unsurprisingly somewhat a market as well. Where do you see the line between maybe harmless sex toys and problematic sexualized smart wives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, we haven't got an issue with sex toys or sex robots in and of themselves, but the kinds of sex robots that we're seeing on the market have very similar kind of issues as what we're seeing with some of the feminization of other forms of devices, in that they are reduced down to a very particular stereotype of femininity. And the main issue with sex robots is that often that femininity that they are stereotyped at is based on very pornified ideas of what a woman is and how she should act and how she should perform. And there's not enough variation there.
I guess the other sort of interesting development, I think, in this space is the continuum that we talk about in the book between a digital voice assistant and a sex robot, and how the sex robot industry's ambitions are very much a sort of Stepford wife style robot that can really do it all, that has it's able to have a conversation with you, that's able to do housework, and that's also available for sex. And again, very much going back to those kind of traditional and service-oriented roles of stereotypical wife, and embedding those in a well, it's more of a design ideal at the moment. I'm not sure that we really have many of these currently on the market, but at least not in the way that they're envisioned. But certainly that's the kind of end goal, and that's quite concerning. And it's not so much about the individual's interaction necessarily, but about what these devices potentially do en masse when we've got, say, something like a digital voice assistant, which millions of people have. When we have them all performing or delivering a very similar type of personality, what is millions, billions of people interacting with these things? What does that reinforce for us in terms of stereotypes? What does it do to the relationships that we have, both with those devices in family and household units, but also in terms of how we think about femininity and women in society? So they're all the kind of bigger questions, I guess, that we're concerned about when we see these stereotypes, some more harmful than others, as Jenny said, embedded in these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a very interesting connection you draw between sex bots and digital home assistants, which are clearly not sex bots, but which may react inappropriately to sexual advances by the user or by abusive behavior by the user, or even encourage them. Do these devices have to learn to say no better, or how should this be addressed?
Yeah, that is one of the issues that we raise in the book, is that these are very docile, subservient assistants. They're not able to, or they're not programmed to respond back against any kind of abusive language generally. And so what that has the effect of doing is creating kind of expectations around what kinds of abusive engagement might be possible. So we would like to see, again, like more options there in terms of what and how devices could respond to abusive language. How that can be done, we're not entirely sure. That's one of the kind of, again, conversations to be had with your colleagues and with other kind of other scholars in this space.
And you know that we are aware this is an area where companies like Google have been responding, you know, proactively for some time, and things have improved in terms of responses to sexual harassment and abuse. But there is, we think, still some way to go. And you know, there is another chapter in the book called "Bitches with Glitches," which is all about how when a device malfunctions or behaves what might be deemed inappropriately, or just can't understand something or whatever, that the feminized device is blamed. So rather than, say, the company or the team that was responsible for the problem or the glitch. And technology companies that make these devices sort of facilitate that occurring by presenting the device as a personality, as its own sort of anthropomorphized entity, rather than sort of being very clear that when something goes wrong, or when a device is unable to respond, that it is something that, you know, the company is addressing, and kind of bringing it back to the people that are designing the devices, rather than letting the blame sit with the feminized device. And you know, that where we see this most commonly occurring is in the media and in popular culture, and in the discussion around these devices, not necessarily in the design itself of the devices, although that is obviously facilitating this issue. And you know, we talk about like the headlines that are used when a device goes wrong. We have a whole, you know, pages dedicated to examples of this, of how, you know, Siri needs its mouth washed out with water, or, you know, and they often use very derogatory feminine stereotypes to dismiss or blame the devices, rather than, again, kind of addressing it at the company level, at the design level, you know, and putting the blame where we think it belongs, or the issue where it belongs.
Yeah, again, one remark. If you're in the chat and if you're watching live, please do post your questions. I have a couple of more questions, but then we'll take audience questions as well. So in the past decades, I'd like to think that a lot of progress has been made towards gender equity. But obviously, we all know that there's still a lot of progress to be made left. Would you say that the popularity of the devices that you call smart wives inhibit that progress?
I'm not sure I'd say that they inhibit as much as they don't necessarily propel us forward. And I think what we've seen, especially over the last year with COVID and with like people being kind of working from home, and the way in which that has, like, gendered tensions around labours within the home have reemerged, it kind of shows us how tenuous the gender equity we have gained is. And so to introduce devices with the stereotyped, feminized personas that are based very much around these domestic labours, that can, you know, can be the subjects of verbal abuse, and therefore kind of, you know, be models of the kind of ways in which you can speak to a feminized or female being, is problematic. Yes.
I think there's also, you know, the place where maybe, okay, so what we've been focusing on, I think, for that last decade is how to not design devices that harm progress towards gender equity, how to not, you know, have unconscious biases or overt biases in the design of devices, you know, how not to promote sexual harassment and abuse. So very kind of explicit and quite clear design decisions that can be easily remedied. And that's one thing, and that's great, that's progress. Where I think we can go next is thinking about how can we use technologies to actually progress gender equity. And that is a much, much bigger question that goes beyond just the usability and the interactions that individuals might have with a particular device, and whether or not, you know, it's promoting harassment or not. It's about how are these devices kind of operating in our lives and in our homes, in our families? Are they, for example, meaning that we divert attention away from the questions, the issues, the conversations being on for decades about women's labour in the home, and, you know, broader conversations about aged care, like we were talking about before, and how we properly resource that. Are they sort of, are they supporting our progress towards all of those things as well, or are they not? And so those kinds of questions require, the kinds of research I think that Jenny and I are kind of involved in, which is that kind of in-depth social science research, not the kind of direct kind of usability design interaction kind of stuff. And yeah, they're much harder to tackle and probably also to evaluate and analyse the impact. But given the scale of this technology now and how ubiquitous it is across so many countries, I think we can start to do that, and we are starting to do that kind of research to see what kinds of broader impacts we can have.
We live in a time where more and more people understand that gender is not just man and woman and not just binary, but that it's a whole spectrum. Can this insight somehow be helpful in understanding how to leave these binary patterns behind when it comes to smart devices?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, it's not, we focus on feminisation on the smart wife in that, so we've got a fairly clear focus in the book on women, really. But the book has implications for all genders, and so does the design of these devices, and it is something that we address through some of the reboot suggestions that we include at the end of the book. One of the things we talk about is queering the smart wife, and by that we mean queering its personality, diversifying out the different forms, the different types of them that we see, away from the kind of dominant forms that are really in the mass market right now. And that could be diversifying out, not just kind of switching genders or going genderless, but actually different expressions of femininity and masculinity that are available through these technologies, but also different ways that different genders might interact with these, and that they might support other progress towards gender equity beyond that kind of binary male-female, as you said, Jan.
Would you, when designing these devices, would you propose to aim for building somehow genderless robots? And what would that even mean, if that is possible? Or will we always be in a situation where, even if it's not intended by the producers, people will genderize these robots and see them as persons or something like this? And how should we deal with this?
I think it's humans, we like to categorize things and place things in a kind of a knowable kind of setting. So one of the kind of issues with trying to de-gender or ungender devices is that when they're author-anthropomorphized, then we seek to kind of apply quite human attributes to them. So people will look for signals or features that can be kind of identifiable. And the other kind of issue is that it's not just about how they look, how they sound, it's about how they are interacting with others or with us. So as Yolande was saying, like in the last point about kind of widening and broadening the expressions that these devices have, and the kind of the opportunities for engagement with these devices is probably the most important way we can diversify the gender expressions too.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, we actually sort of steer away from genderless or genderless versions of these devices, and we say let's stick with gender, because where we see the move towards removing or trying to remove gender, it sort of in a way it sort of sweeps the issues under the carpet. It doesn't necessarily address them or solve them, just sort of pretends that they're not there anymore when they still are. What we suggest as another way forward is to just diversify out, like we were talking about before, the types of gender that are on display, or the types of femininity and masculinity and other forms of gender expression that are coming through these devices. You know, we wouldn't expect to only encounter one form of femininity in the kinds of interactions we have with the broad network of people that we all encounter. And yet that seems to be the case now with many of these types of anthropomorphized devices. So, you know, and I know there are some variations. I'm sort of speaking quite generally here. But we would like to see a lot more diversity in those kinds of expressions, and that can be done by staying with gender. It doesn't have to be done by removing gender.
I understand it's a big question, but it's my last question before we go to the audience. How do you fix it?
We have I think it's nine proposals in the book on different things to do. I mean, and then we tried to be not typical, because we know this stuff's been hashed over before, and many of these conversations have been going on for some time. So, you know, I guess there's a couple we could mention, and then Jenny, you can mention a couple more yourself as well. I mean, one of them is about where we draw inspiration from. So we talk a lot in the book about science fiction and how it's become the sort of prototype, the inspiration for many roboticists, for many technology designers, and many products that we now see in our homes. So, and it's also, like the tech industry, it's another male-dominated sort of domain. And one of the things we'd like to see there is some new smart wives, kind of new inspirational smart wives being written into science fiction and being imagined through that portal, rather than, you know, let's accept that is what many of us turn to for these kinds of futuristic inspirations. So why not use that and foster that opportunity to help us think about what else we could create, what else we could design, given it's been so important to us in the past. So that's one kind of angle. Another is to look at the industries, you know, companies like Google and Amazon and other companies that are making these types of devices, and the types of teams that are involved in designing and developing these kinds of technologies. And I know that this has been, you know, something that's been evolving over the, you know, last decade or more now as well, in terms of involving more diverse, you know, having more diverse teams, and, you know, considering gender and also other forms of cultural and ethnic diversity as well. What we're also interested in is bringing in a lot more diversity around the disciplines that are involved, you know, very centrally in the design of these devices. People like sociologists, like us, you know, not that we're necessarily asking for jobs, but, you know, sociologists, media and cultural studies people, gender experts. And I do know that these people are in these, you know, in companies like Google, but perhaps not as many as we would like to see, sort of being very much centrally part of artificial intelligence, of voice communities, and helping to answer some of these bigger questions and explore some of the impacts of these devices on society at large. Jenny, do you want to mention a couple of others?
I think, I mean, like you say, you know, we had 9 in total, I think, suggestions, but the 2 key ones are the ones that Yolande has already outlined. I think they're the most pressing, but also the most difficult to mobilize, because it involves a kind of addressing at, you know, such a systemic level. We have some other suggestions in terms of that have already been kind of mentioned in the conversation, in terms of rethinking how we talk about these types of devices, rethinking how, like in the media, how they're reported, how they kind of perpetuate that anthropomorphization and that kind of derogatory gendered language. And also thinking about the adjusting perhaps some of the responses that we get from these devices, perhaps to be more equitable, to be more feminist, but also to be more queer as well, is one of the, I think, kind of more immediate steps that we can make in terms of reprogramming some of the devices that are already in existence and in our homes.
I'll just probably add one more thing to that. I mean, I think companies like Google obviously are already doing an amazing job at usability and about, and that is kind of to me, looking from the outside in, seems to be, the key strengths of companies like Google. Really understanding user needs, responding, creating devices that people want, that people like. I think that's all really well covered. The questions that we want to see considered are the broader impacts of those decisions on households, on communities, on society, on workplaces, on issues like gender equity and equality and progress towards whatever it is that we collectively want to achieve. And those require different skill sets, but also different methods and different research to kind of help us understand that. And I guess probably also a kind of different ethos of not just focusing on the products that people are most likely to want, use and buy, but also how those products can also feed into a broader sort of set of values around progress on particular issues and matters that we should all care about.
Yeah, these are great points, and I think learning about the other points of these 9 points is a great incentive to buy the book as well. We do have time for audience questions. I think there's at least one question in the live chat. Yeah, Sashin asks, how do you envision the next 10 years with AR? Seems more likely to become mainstream. Example, science fiction, an AR interactive hologram which can act like your friend, helper, etc.
Well, you're right. There are already, devices on the market with an interactive hologram, so that are kind of already like have the same issues. We talk about one of them in the book. The names kind of escape me at the moment.
Azuma?
That's
Azuma,
it.
right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
It's more of an assistant than augmented reality, though, isn't it? I guess it's kind of a combination of both.
Yeah. But I guess what it kind of points to is we need to think about these gendered problems now, given that these devices, like the voice assistants, are already mainstream, but there will be new permutations of these kinds of assistants, perhaps, with AR, perhaps with holograms. And if we don't think carefully about the way in which they are anthropomorphized, they are humanized, and they are gendered, and we don't provide range as they're being built, then this issue becomes even larger.
Yeah, one of the things that struck us in writing the book was that it seems like, and this is just, kind of, I guess, a general observation that we made, that the more advanced the technology is, seems the more we want to hark back to traditional gender stereotypes. So I'm a little bit concerned about emerging technologies like AR and VR and even some robots for this reason. And, we reflect on that a little bit in the book and why that might be the case. And I think it comes back to that sense of familiarity and trustworthiness that Jenny mentioned before, that when we're faced with something new and potentially confronting with all the kinds of challenges it might have and the uncanny valley and everything, we sort of, we look to what's familiar. We look to what, we knew from our past and our childhoods, or, we look to traditional values. And that's kind of maybe why we see some of that kind of coming into what should be, you would think, the most progressive technology that we're making, but not necessarily in terms of the values it's promoting. So I don't know what that means for the next 10 years, but hopefully conversations like this can, and maybe some more inspiration from sci-fi, depending on where we kind of go to with that next, might help with that.
Yeah. I guess the main question is like, how do you design in diversity into something that you also want to be mass produced?
But even, a question too, even terms like friend and helper, I think that there are other terms that we can really kind of interrogate a bit more. What does it mean to have a friend? I mean, a friend there's many different types of friends in society. We all have there's lots of diversity in what it means to be a friend. So again, we want to sort of avoid, I think, locking in a particular type of friendship that is embodied en masse in advanced technology, just like we want to avoid a particular stereotype of gender being locked in, and the same with helper. So, and I know why we sort of turn to those more kind of non-threatening versions of friends and helpers that are really just there to serve us in the design of technology. But I hope that we can find ways to innovate and get past that, to think about different types of relationships and different types of personalities that could be part of these devices that we live with in the future.
Are you yourself optimistic that the industry and the market will react to this feedback and integrate these things, or are you pessimistic about that?
It depends on what day you ask me. Today I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably the same as Jenny. There are other things that we touch on in the book as well that are probably bigger concerns for me, like the ethical and the environmental impacts of mass-produced smart wives, which we have a whole chapter on in the book, and also the gendered impacts of that in terms of the labour, in terms of the creation of smart wives, and also where the impacts are felt around the world in terms of extraction of minerals and also e-waste. So those are probably things that leave me quite pessimistic when I start to think about those implications. I like to think that the gender equity and the equality issues are things that we can actually tangibly address.
I think in the book we managed to be kind of, in the writing of the book, we would both kind of oscillate between being optimistic and pessimistic, and we would each take turns in both, and that kind of helped balance out the writing, and that we don't take an overly pessimistic view, but we don't take an overly optimistic view either.
I think we have more questions from the chat. Isabel asks, in your studies, did you ever come across on the topic of smart devices being used against women as form of domestic abuse? I've been seeing in the news and even non-profit organizations discussing it.
Yes, yep. We've got also a chapter in the book on this topic, and I guess some of the precedents that lead towards it we've already touched on. This idea that the types of work that goes into putting devices into the home, the digital housekeeping, tends to be done by men in a heteronormative household, and often, and so there are opportunities to use smart devices for coercion and for control, because if one person knows the network, knows what devices are there, has all the passwords, then yes, there are growing numbers of cases of smart devices being used in domestic abuse situations, and it's something that first responders are having to be ever more aware of when they're helping victims. And it's one of the things I think that that we talk about is this idea that the safety around these devices, like it's often not like to use security smart devices are often marketed in terms of protecting the people within the home from unknown others outside of the home. But what we're finding with these devices is often, it's not the device itself that's the problem, it's the relationship and the dynamic that it is being used within. But, like all forms of domestic abuse, the threat generally comes from within the house rather than outside it.
Yeah, and this particular issue comes in with a range of smart devices, or smart wives, which we, typically kind of smart home and automated setups in the home. So not so much with digital voice systems. So often they're like a gateway device that helps us kind of control various other appliances and various other kind of smart home devices. And it is, and those, we look at how they're often marketed towards men, those kinds of devices, particularly things that involve security and entertainment. And then how that kind of becomes part of this larger sort of smart home ecosystem, with the end goal being a home, you know, obviously the dream that has been around for many years, that we have a home that sort of does it all and does everything for you, kind of the ultimate smart wife, if you like. You barely have to lift a finger. It'll basically, you know, do the dishes and cook your dinner and put you to bed. So, you know, that kind of vision has been more appealing to men, and hence, you know, kind of they've been the ones mostly instigating bringing this stuff into the home, which raises all these other issues, as Jenny said. And
yeah,
they change as well. Yeah, so hopefully that will change.
We have one more question from the chat. I'm asked, can't we say that feminizing speech machines is simply a reflection of language in general, which also treats gender in clear classes and associations? Yeah, I mean,
To some extent, yes, all language is gendered, if I understand this question correctly. So I'm just kind of not entirely clear what Haim means here, but I guess what the point we were making is that the gendered speech of most machines is of a very narrow kind. So gendered language in general, I would say, is a lot more diverse, even the ways in which we refer or speak about women. The types of feminization that we might encounter on even a day-to-day basis would be much more diverse than what we're seeing built into assistants and various other types of robotics and smart home devices.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, the issue with the sort of the feminization of voice is that the feminization comes mostly from the pitch of the voice, from the tone of the voice, and through limiting actually the language that is available for the machine to use in ways that reflect and represent kind of norms and expectations within society.
Yeah, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us and for talking about your book with us, Dr. Yolande Strengers and Dr. Jenny Kennedy. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.